May 14, 1805. The Missouri River, somewhere in what would become Montana. A boat carrying crucial supplies for the Lewis and Clark expedition suddenly capsizes in choppy water. The French-Canadian helmsman panics and freezes. Books, instruments, medicines, journals, everything essential to the expedition's survival, begins washing away into the rushing river. A teenage girl, her 2-month-old baby strapped to her back, calmly reaches into the water. While others panic, Sacagawea stayed calm and rescued instruments, books, gunpowder, medicines, and clothing from the water. Sacagawea had the presence of mind to gather crucial papers, books, navigational instruments, medicines, and other provisions that might have otherwise disappeared, all while simultaneously ensuring her baby's safety. Lewis and Clark would later write that, without her quick thinking, the expedition might have failed entirely. In appreciation, Lewis and Clark named a branch of the Missouri River for Sacagawea several days later. This is one of many moments when Sacagawea proved indispensable to the core of discovery. But the popular legend of Sacagawea, the brave Indian maiden who guided Lewis and Clark across America, is both true and deeply misleading. The real story is more complicated, more remarkable, and far more tragic. She was about 12 years old when a Hidatsa raiding party captured her. She was enslaved. At about age 13, she was sold into a non-consensual marriage to Charbonneau, a Quebecois trapper. She received no pay for her services and died on December 20th, 1812. She wasn't a guide for most of the journey. She was a kidnapped Shoshone girl forced into marriage who happened to speak the language Lewis and Clark needed. At about 17 years of age, she was the only woman among 31 older men on this portion of the expedition. And she did it all with an infant on her back. This is Sacagawea's true story, not the myth, but the woman. What she endured, what she contributed, and why the legend we've created obscures the reality of her life. Sacagawea was born into the Lemhi Shoshone tribe around the year 1788. The Lemhi Shoshone lived in what is today known as the Lemhi River Valley in Idaho. Born in 1788 or 1789, a member of the Lemhi Band of the Native American Shoshone tribe, Sacagawea grew up surrounded by the Rocky Mountains in the Salmon River region of what is now Idaho. Nothing more is known about Sacagawea's early childhood. We don't know her parents' names. We don't know if she had siblings besides the brother she would later encounter. We know almost nothing about her first 12 years. What we do know is that the Lemhi Shoshone were a nomadic people, following seasonal patterns for hunting and gathering. They lived in harmony with the harsh mountain environment, moving with the seasons, relying on extensive knowledge of the land. Sacagawea would have learned the skills of her people, how to find edible plants, how to track game, how to survive in the wilderness. These skills, learned as a Shoshone child, would later prove invaluable to the expedition. In 1800, Sacagawea was captured by Hidatsa warriors during a raid that killed many people in her village. Born into a tribe of Shoshones who still live on the Salmon River in the state of Idaho, she had been among a number of women and children captured by Hidatsas who raided their camp near the Missouri River's headwaters about 5 years previously. The Hidatsa were enemies of the Shoshone. They raided Shoshone camps, killed the men and elders, and took women and children as captives. This wasn't unusual. Intertribal warfare and raiding were common on the plains. But understanding that this was common doesn't make it less traumatic. Sacagawea was 12 years old. She watched people she knew die. She was torn from her family, her home, her people. She was marched hundreds of miles to a completely different environment, from mountain valleys to the northern plains. It was her Hidatsa captors who gave her the name Sacagawea, which means bird woman. Even her name wasn't her own. We don't know what her Shoshone name was. The Hidatsa renamed her. The warriors brought Sacagawea to a Hidatsa Mandan settlement in present-day North Dakota. About a year later, when Sacagawea was only 13 years old, her captors forced her to marry French trapper Toussaint Charbonneau. Let's be clear about what this was: child marriage, sexual slavery. She was sold into a non-consensual marriage to Charbonneau. He had also bought another young Shoshone girl, known as Otter Woman, for a wife. Charbonneau was variously reported to have purchased both girls from the Hidatsa, or to have one Sacagawea while gambling. Charbonneau was in his 40s. He already had one young Shoshone wife. Now he bought or won a second, a 13-year-old girl. By 1804, when Lewis and Clark arrived, Sacagawea was about 16 or 17 and pregnant with her first child. She'd spent 4 or 5 years living among the Hidatsa, married to a man she hadn't chosen, far from her people. This is the context that's often sanitized in tellings of the story. Sacagawea didn't volunteer for the Lewis and Clark expedition. She didn't have agency in the decision. She was the property of a man who was hired, and she came along as part of the package. When explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark arrived at the Mandan Hidatsa villages and built Fort Mandan for wintering over in 1804-05, they interviewed several trappers who might be able to interpret or guide the expedition. Knowing they would need to communicate with the tribal nations who lived at the headwaters of the Missouri River, they agreed to hire Toussaint Charbonneau in early winter of 1804, who claimed to speak several native languages, and one of his wives, who spoke Shoshone. The communication chain would work like this. Lewis and Clark spoke English. One expedition member spoke French. Charbonneau spoke French and Hidatsa. Sacagawea spoke Hidatsa and Shoshone. Through this translation chain, communications with the Shoshone would be possible. Lewis and Clark also recognized that the Shoshone had horses they would need to purchase. They needed Shoshone horses to cross the Rocky Mountains. To get horses, they needed to communicate with the Shoshone. To communicate, they needed Sacagawea. On February 11, 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, whom Clark later nicknamed Pomp, meaning firstborn in Shoshone. She gave birth in a frontier fort in the dead of winter. The birth was difficult. One expedition member administered crushed rattlesnake rattle as a supposed aid to childbirth, a folk remedy of dubious value. 2 months later, with her baby on her back and her husband by her side, Sacagawea and the men left Fort Mandan on April 7, 1805. Think about this. She'd just given birth. She had a 2-month-old infant, and she was about to embark on an 8,000-mile journey through unmapped wilderness, traveling by boat and on foot, through mountains and deserts, facing starvation, dangerous river crossings, and unknown dangers. In 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, while traveling with the Lewis and Clark expedition. She had no choice in this. Charbonneau was hired. She and her infant son came along. The legend says Sacagawea guided Lewis and Clark across America. The reality is more complex and more interesting. She appeared in the captain's journals 4 times before her name was given. She was with the expedition for just over 16 of the 28 months of the official journey. She guided only a few times. Historian Stephen Ambrose, in his book Undaunted Courage about the Lewis and Clark expedition, contends that the teenage wife was not a guide and was not consulted by either Lewis or Clark. However, they did ask her for advice for a water route when they reached her native hunting grounds. Her contributions were different but equally vital. Language skills. She interpreted when they reached Shoshone territory. Foraging knowledge. She was skilled at finding plants for food and medicine to help keep the explorers alive. She was also skilled at finding edible plants, which proved to be crucial to supplementing their rations along the journey. Cultural knowledge. Further, Sacagawea was valuable to the expedition because her presence signified peace and trustworthiness. A group of men traveling with a woman and her baby appeared less menacing than an all-male group, which could be mistaken for a war party. Practical skills. She made moccasins and clothing, processed hides, cooked, performed domestic labor that kept the expedition functioning. Crisis management. The boat rescue incident proved her capability under pressure. In August 1805, the expedition reached Shoshone territory. They desperately needed horses to cross the Rocky Mountains. Without horses, the expedition would fail. By August 1805, the Corps had located a Shoshone tribe and was attempting to trade for horses to cross the Rocky Mountains. They used Sacagawea to interpret and discovered that the tribe's leader, Kamiwait, was her brother. Sacagawea was surprised and happy to recognize the Shoshone's leader, Chief Kamiwait, as her brother, and they had an emotional reunion. Imagine this moment. 5 years after being kidnapped, hundreds of miles from home, Sacagawea encounters her own people. And the chief, the leader, is her brother. Sacagawea and Camewait had not seen one another since their hunting camp near the Three Forks was attacked by Miniter Hidatsa warriors in about the year 1800. She and her sister, along with some other females and 4 boys, were captured. Her sister. She had a sister who was also captured. We don't know what happened to that sister. The historical record is silent. Her reunion with her family cemented the expedition for Lewis and Clark. It may have been the breakthrough they needed since they required native help to get over the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana and Idaho. Camewait sold horses to the travelers and provided guides to get them over the mountains. The reunion secured the horses, probably saved the expedition, but for Sacagawea it was bittersweet. She'd found her brother, and then had to leave him again. She continued with the expedition rather than staying with her people. We don't know if this was her choice or Charbonneau's. The historical record doesn't say. Upon arriving at the Pacific coast, she was able to voice her opinion about where the expedition should spend the winter and was granted her request to visit the ocean to see a beached whale. This is significant. After reaching the Pacific coast in November 1805, Sacagawea was allowed to cast her vote along with the other members of the expedition for where they would build a fort to stay for the winter. A teenage Native American woman, technically not even a member of the Corps, not on the payroll, was allowed to vote alongside the men on an important decision. This was 115 years before women in the United States would get the right to vote nationally. She gave up her beaded belt to enable the captains to trade for a fur robe they wished to bring back to give to President Thomas Jefferson. She had so little that was her own, yet she gave up her belt, likely one of her few personal possessions, to help the expedition obtain something for the president. Sacagawea left the group to return to what is now Bismarck, North Dakota, before the triumphant return of Lewis and Clark to St. Louis, Missouri, in 1806. She received no pay for her services. Let that sink in. She traveled thousands of miles, saved crucial supplies, interpreted with her own people, foraged for food, made clothing, voted on decisions, did all of this while caring for an infant, and she received nothing. Charbonneau was paid. The men were paid. Sacagawea got nothing. She didn't return to St. Louis for the celebration. She went back to the Hidatsa villages, back to the people who had enslaved her, married to the man who had bought her. Following the expedition, Clark offered to school the young Charbonneau child, Jean-Baptiste. William Clark had grown fond of young Pomp. Clark, in particular, developed a close bond with Sacagawea as she and Baptiste would often accompany him as he took his turn walking the shore. In 1809, it is believed that she and her husband, or just her husband, according to some accounts, traveled with their son to St. Louis to see Clark. Pomp was left in Clark's care. Some accounts say Sacagawea went to St. Louis. Others say only Charbonneau took the boy. Either way, the result was the same. Jean-Baptiste was taken from his mother to be educated by Clark. Clark wanted to adopt Pompey, but instead invited the family to move to St. Louis, Missouri, where he could oversee the boy's education. They made the move in 1809. This is where the story becomes deeply uncertain. Only a few months after her daughter's arrival, she reportedly died at Fort Manuel in what is now Kennel, South Dakota, around 1812. In 1812, Sacagawea gave birth to a daughter named Lizette. Historians don't know for sure when Sacagawea died. The historical record indicates that she died of an illness shortly after her daughter was born in 1812. Clark adopted both of her children in 1813, which would not have been possible if city officials thought Sacagawea was still alive. This is the official history. Death at age 24 or 25, shortly after giving birth to her daughter. But there's another version. Indigenous oral traditions say that she left her husband in 1812 and married a member of the Comanche tribe. In this version, she eventually returned to the Shoshone village where she was born and died there in 1884. The Hidatsa people maintain a detailed oral tradition that Sacagawea was a member of their tribe who lived until 1869. After the Lewis and Clark expedition, she had 3 daughters, Cedar Woman, Different Breast, and Otter Woman. She lived among the Hidatsa until 1869, when she died at age 82. Which version is true? We don't know. The written record says she died in 1812. Oral traditions from multiple tribes say she lived much longer, left Charbonneau, had more children, and returned to her people. The uncertainty itself is telling. Even in death, Sacagawea's story is unclear, contested, erased. Within a year, Clark became legal guardian to both Lisette and Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Pomp, lived an extraordinary life. Baptiste traveled in Europe and held a variety of jobs in the American West before he died in 1866. He was educated, traveled to Germany, served as a guide and mountain man, and became something of a celebrity because of his connection to the Lewis and Clark expedition. But Lisette? While little is known of Lisette's life, most historians believe she died in childhood. Like her mother, she fades from the historical record. Sacagawea's fictionalized image as a genuine Indian princess was promulgated most widely in the early 20th century by a popular 1902 novel by Eva Emery Dye that took liberties in recounting the travails of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The legend of Sacagawea as the indispensable guide who led Lewis and Clark across America was largely invented in the early 1900s. The National American Women's Suffrage Association of the early 20th century adopted Sacagawea as a symbol of women's worth and independence, erecting several statues and plaques in her memory. The suffragists needed a heroine. They needed a woman who had achieved something remarkable, who had proven women's capabilities. Sacagawea fit the bill. But they romanticized her. They turned her into an Indian princess. She wasn't. They credited her with guiding the entire expedition. She didn't. They created a legend that served their purposes but obscured the complicated truth. The real Sacagawea's story is actually more impressive than the legend. She was a kidnapped child forced into marriage who nevertheless made crucial contributions to one of America's most important expeditions. She did all of this as a teenager with an infant on her back, in a group of 31 men, receiving no payment and little recognition. Remarkably, Sacagawea did it all while caring for the son she bore just 2 months before departing. She saved the expedition's journals when the boat capsized. She helped them obtain horses from her own brother's tribe. She foraged for food. She made clothing. She provided cultural knowledge and interpretation. Her presence signaled peaceful intent to tribes they encountered. And then she went back to obscurity, dying young or perhaps living to old age. We don't know. Forgotten until the suffragists rediscovered her decades later. Reliable historical information about Sacagawea is very limited. We don't know her Shoshone birth name, when exactly she was born, when or how she died, what happened to her daughter Lisette, whether she chose to continue with the expedition or had no choice, how she felt about leaving her brother and her people. Her own words, almost nothing she said was recorded. The historical record is written by those who wrote it down, the white men on the expedition. Sacagawea appears in their journals, but always through their eyes, their interpretations. We don't have her voice. We don't have her perspective. We have only fragments, seen through the lens of men who didn't fully understand or value her contribution. Possibly the most memorialized woman in the United States, with dozens of statues and monuments, Sacagawea lived a short but legendarily eventful life in the American West. But what should we remember her for? Not the romanticized Indian princess. Not the indispensable guide to the whole expedition. Remember her as a survivor. A kidnapped child who endured enslavement and forced marriage. A teenage mother who traveled thousands of miles through wilderness with an infant. A woman who made crucial contributions despite having no agency, no payment, no recognition. Remember that her story is incomplete, written by others, shaped by their needs and biases, missing her own voice. Remember that behind every legend is a more complicated human being. On May 14, 1805, when a boat capsized on the Missouri River, a teenage girl with a baby on her back calmly rescued the Lewis and Clark expedition's most important supplies from the water. That moment encapsulates who Sacagawea was, not the legend, but the woman. Capable, resilient, doing what needed to be done despite impossible circumstances. She was kidnapped at 12, enslaved, forced into marriage at 13, had a baby at 16 or 17, traveled 8,000 miles with that infant on her back, interpreted with her own people who she hadn't seen in 5 years, gave up her own possessions to help the expedition, and received nothing for it. No payment, no recognition in her lifetime, just a return to obscurity. The legend we created serves our purposes. The brave guide, the Indian princess, the symbol of women's capabilities. But the truth is more complex and more remarkable. Sacagawea was a real person whose story has been told by everyone except herself. She appears in history books as a supporting character in someone else's story, Lewis and Clark's story, but she had her own story. We just don't know most of it. What we do know is enough to honor her not as a legend, but as a woman who survived impossible circumstances and made crucial contributions despite having no power, no choice, no voice in how her story would be told. The statues and monuments call her a hero. Maybe she was. But she was also a victim of kidnapping, of slavery, of forced marriage, of historical erasure. Both things can be true. In fact, both things must be true if we're going to tell her story honestly. Sacagawea, kidnapped, enslaved, exploited, forgotten, and yet, against all of that, remarkable. That's the truth behind the legend.